Hello there! The next major version of Linux Mint is almost upon us. Version 22, also called Linux Mint Wilma. The beta's just been released. In this video I'm going to install it and have a look at the new features that are boasted about on their latest blog page. Before we dive into the new version, for those who aren't familiar, I shall quickly cover how the Linux Mint releases work. For a more detailed explanation of what Linux Mint and how it is made, check out my video, What is Linux Mint? In that video we learned that Linux Mint is based off another Linux distribution called Ubuntu. Ubuntu released two new versions a year, one around April and another around October. This is so they can get new features out as often as possible. The problem is, not everyone wants to upgrade all that often, and sometimes releasing new features that regularly introduces more bugs than some users, especially enterprise customers, might like to have. They often aren't supported for very long, which means that after about a year there are no more bug fixes or security patches released. You then have to upgrade to the new version to continue receiving these, which is kind of a critical need for most people. To solve this problem, every couple of years or so they release an LTS version. LTS stands for long-term support. They're typically supported for 5 to 10 years, depending on the release and the agreement you have with Canonical, who make Ubuntu. These type of releases tend not to offer as many new features and focus mostly on bug fixes and reliability. This is perfect for enterprise customers and for people who just want a computer that works and are less bothered about new features. This works well for most cases, however it can sometimes catch people out if they stay on an older version for too long, and these are some of the reasons why. Newer hardware might not work as well, or at all. This is because the drivers built into the Linux kernel itself get out of date. If you're not sure what a kernel is, check out my video, What is Linux Mint? Newer versions of software might not be compatible when this release is getting older either. And while excellent attempts are being made to provide bug fixes and security patches to old versions of the Linux kernel which are built into these older LTS releases, particularly as they're getting older, not all the patches are backported, and this can sometimes lead to some problems. The Linux Mint team decided to base their operating system on the LTS releases of Ubuntu. That way they get access to lots of applications which are available in Ubuntu and Debian, as well as getting enterprise class reliability. Linux Mint typically makes 4 releases off one Ubuntu LTS release. This is so they can roll out new features over a period of a few years until the next LTS release comes along. These releases are usually very minor and are what you might consider dot releases. For example, Linux Mint will have the major release 22, which will then be followed later by the minor release 22.1 and then later 22.2 and then 22.3. To work around the first issue that I pointed out of some hardware not working with LTS releases, Linux Mint decided that they would provide an edge version of their releases once it'd been around for a while, and this is what they call the edge version. And what they do is they put a newer version of the Linux kernel into the LTS release that they have, and then that provides better hardware support later on in the release. So the next release is due out this summer, and it's a major release based off Ubuntu LTS version 24.04, and that means we've got a shiny new version of Linux with version 6.8, which has lots of enhancements over the old version, even the Edge version in the previous release with 21.3, as well as other enhancements and newer versions of programs. Linux Mint also has a number of different editions. This is because not everyone wants the same thing from the operating system. Some people want it to look a certain way or work a certain way, and other people, particularly if you've got older hardware, need a version that's a lot lighter so that it runs well. So we have the main versions, which are Cinnamon, Mate or Mate, and XFCE. Cinnamon is the main version and the one that I'll be demonstrating. It also is the one that is most similar to the way Windows looks and feels, or at least the classic versions. Mate or Mate edition is aimed at people who really like the old classic GNOME 2 Linux desktop style. XFCE edition is the lightest version and best for running on old hardware. So let's get started with the install. Booting up the installer, It's got about the same look and feel as the previous version did, and the installer works in pretty much exactly the same way, so there's nothing really new right here. But once it's installed and I've sped up the process, let's take a look at the new features which are quoted in the blog post. So here we are logged into Linux Mint 22 for the first time, and just to prove it, here's the welcome screen with Linux Mint 22 Cinnamon Edition 64 in the bottom right hand corner. So the first thing on the blog post that they explain as a new thing with Linux Mint 22 is better language support. Now it reads, and this is the first line, improvements were made for Linux Mint 22 installations to be better localized and use less disk space than before. Now to me it's unclear if it's just improvements to how it's packaged and removing languages that are no longer needed after the end of installation, or whether they have provided more language support. However, I'd like to show you just how much language support there is, and it's actually pretty good. So if we go to the menu and then preferences and scroll down to languages and click here, so it's got my United Kingdom one that I selected during setup, but I can install and remove other ones, and as we can see there's a number of standard English ones already installed, and there's apparently some language packs missing which I can install by pressing the install language packs. But say I wanted something other than English, or maybe you do, there's this very long list of languages, and not just languages but regionalised per country as well. It's quite impressive. So let's say for example I wanted Welsh. I don't speak Welsh, but why not? It's got a dragon on the flag, it's pretty cool. So install. And there it is. And then install the additional language packs, which will just go and pull down for me. And continue. And just like that, should I wish to, I could select Welsh for my computer language. Well, I think I do have to apply it system-wide for it to apply. And I don't speak Welsh, so I'm not going to do that right now. However, that's the first feature. Pretty good language support, and they've improved how it's packaged at the very least. Next, we have support for new technology, which, to be honest, with a new version of operating system, I wouldn't expect anything less. I'm not going to go into all the details of exactly what is new regarding this, other than you'll probably find you're going to get better performance on newer hardware with a new version of the Linux kernel. You've got better support for new themes, and just other nice little things that the older version was probably lacking. Of course, if you really want to go into that detail, check out their blog post, which I'm going to link in the description to find out exactly what new support is included. Support for popular features is the next item on the blog post. Now, it's important to recognise that they've not put new features, it's just features. And that's because Linux Mint don't always feel that the new features that get pushed down from Ubuntu are necessarily better, or not just Ubuntu but other software providers as well that feed into the entire application ecosystem. Linux Mint often want their software and programs that come with it to look and feel a certain way, and for that reason, even though we're getting a new version of the operating system, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to get a new version of all the programs that come with it that Ubuntu would. So if having the very latest and greatest of everything is important to you, then Linux Mint might not quite be the distribution for you, and you should maybe look at Fedora. That said, if you want consistency and to just switch from the current version of Linux Mint to this new version of Linux Mint, you should probably find that things just work and are in a similar place, if not exactly the same place, and that all the theming is consistent and so on, because they really do take this very seriously, even at the cost of sticking with an older version for longer if need be. That said, this next version of Linux Mint should have pretty good cloud support for various providers if that's what you want from your computer. Next, we have updates to the Linux Mint Software Manager, and for those who aren't familiar with that, that is basically Linux Mint's version of the App Store. It's going to load a bit faster than it did before, and also apps coming from the FlatHub repository, which are not verified as coming from the application vendor, aren't going to show by default unless you turn them on, and that is to try and improve some security around unverified apps. There is some debate as to whether this is the best way of improving the security of software coming from the software manager, as even if you tell it to turn on the unverified software packages, which may well be absolutely fine, it doesn't show the reviews. So if you want to find out what other people think about that particular release or package of that software, you have to go online to FlatHub to find them, which might not be so good if you're not sure and want to see what other people's experiences have been. HexChat has been discontinued, so Linux Mint has changed its default IRC application to Matrix instead. It also looks a lot more modern, which is a nice touch for a new operating system. If you're installing Linux Mint Cinnamon Edition, then Cinnamon 6.2 is out. Version 6.2 doesn't have anything like hugely groundbreakingly new, but it does have a number of nice little enhancements to make life a bit easier. For example, Nemo actions, so that is the file explorer, can be organised with the new layout editor, and there's apparently fewer printer notifications, and Wayland support and better avatar support, among other features. There are also a lot of other minor feature enhancements to the operating system, which are listed on their blog post if you wish to see them. And finally, as with every release of Linux Mint, we get new background artwork, and this is no exception. So when you get Linux Mint 22 installed and you try and decide which desktop background to have, go and have a look at the default ones which come with the operating system, because there might just be one that you like. In conclusion, Linux Mint 22 seems to be more evolution than revolution. There's a lot of nice new little improvements here and there, and a newer version of the Linux kernel and some newer software available. But other than that, there's nothing earth-shatteringly new or different about it, which in many ways is a good thing if you just want a computer that works. So, will you be upgrading to Linux Mint 22 when it comes out this summer, or will you be waiting a while for something else? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.